1920s wedding photo restored, and everyone notices one creepy detail. The photography studio in Boston's North End had seen better days, but Emma Castellano had always loved its worn brick walls and the way afternoon light filtered through the tall windows. She specialized in photo restoration, breathing new life into damaged images that families treasured, but time had nearly destroyed. Most requests were straightforward: faded wedding portraits, cracked family gatherings, water-damaged baby pictures that needed digital repair, and careful color correction. The email that arrived on a cold March morning seemed routine at first. A woman named Dorothy Harris from Providence, Rhode Island, had inherited a box of family photographs after her grandmother's death. Among them was a wedding photo from 1927, severely damaged by moisture and age, the emulsion flaking away in places, the image obscured by decades of deterioration. Dorothy wanted it restored as a gift for her elderly mother, who had never known much about her grandmother's wedding day. Emma downloaded the attached scan and opened it in her restoration software. Even in its damaged state, she could make out the basic composition: a church interior, the bride and groom standing at the altar, guests seated in pews on either side. The bride wore a typical mid-1920s wedding dress: dropped waist, knee-length hem, a cloche-style veil adorned with orange blossoms. The groom stood stiffly in a dark suit, his face partially obscured by a water stain that had eaten through the photograph's surface. She began the painstaking process of digital restoration, working pixel by pixel to reconstruct damaged areas, using undamaged portions of the image as reference. The bride's face emerged first, young, perhaps 19 or 20, with dark eyes and a small, uncertain smile. The groom appeared older, maybe 30, his expression serious and formal. As Emma worked deeper into the background of the image, adjusting contrast and clarity to reveal details hidden by age and damage, something caught her attention. In the back left corner of the church, partially obscured by shadow and the architectural column, stood a figure that didn't belong with the other guests. The man wore working clothes, rough fabric, a cap pulled low over his face. While everyone else sat in the pews facing forward toward the ceremony, this figure stood pressed against the wall, half hidden in the darkness near the church's side entrance. His posture was tense, his body angled as though ready to flee at any moment. Emma zoomed in, enhancing the area with specialized filters. The man's face was turned toward the altar, toward the bride specifically, and even through the degraded image quality, Emma could see something in his expression that made her pause: raw, undisguised grief. She sat back from her computer, unsettled. Who was this man, and why was he hiding in the shadows during what should have been a joyful celebration? Emma spent the next 3 days working on the photograph, but she couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the shadows. As she progressively cleaned and enhanced the image, more details emerged that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The man appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s, with weathered features that suggested a life of outdoor labor. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind a working-class man might wear on his one day off, not appropriate for a wedding but the best he owned. His hands gripped the brim of his cap so tightly that even in the photograph, Emma could see the tension in his knuckles. But it was his eyes that arrested her attention. Using advanced enhancement techniques, she managed to sharpen the resolution enough to see his face with remarkable clarity. He wasn't looking at the ceremony as a whole. His gaze was fixed entirely on the bride, with an intensity that spoke of profound connection and equally profound loss. Emma examined the rest of the photograph more carefully, looking for any other anomalies. The guests in the pews were formally dressed, clearly family and friends of means. The church itself was elegant: carved wooden pews, stained glass windows visible in the background, elaborate floral arrangements flanking the altar. This was not a modest ceremony but a society wedding, the kind announced in newspaper social columns. She noticed something else. Several guests in the back pews had turned slightly, their attention not on the bride and groom but directed toward the shadowed corner where the mysterious man stood. One elderly woman's face showed clear disapproval. A younger man in the opposite pew appeared ready to stand, his body language suggesting he was prepared to intervene if the interloper caused any disruption. The wedding party seemed unaware. The bride and groom faced the minister, their backs to the congregation. The two bridesmaids and the best man stood in their designated positions, focused on the ceremony. But that man in the shadows watched everything with the desperate attention of someone witnessing something precious being taken away forever. Emma created a separate high-resolution file of just that corner of the photograph, enhancing it as much as the available data allowed. She studied the man's features, committing them to memory, and then began examining the rest of the image for any other clues about his identity or purpose. In the bride's hands, she noticed something she hadn't seen before: a small bouquet of lily of the valley, traditional for spring weddings. But tucked among the delicate white flowers was a single red rose, its color standing out starkly even in the faded photograph. The bride's left hand gripped that rose so tightly that one thorn had drawn blood, a small dark spot visible on her white glove. Emma leaned closer to her screen, her pulse quickening. The bride's uncertain smile suddenly looked different, not shy or nervous, but strained, perhaps even frightened. And that man in the shadows, watching with such grief, suddenly seemed less like an intruder and more like a witness to something wrong. Before sending the restored image to Dorothy, Emma decided she needed more context. She composed a careful email, attaching a preview of her work and asking if Dorothy knew anything about the man visible in the background of the photograph. She mentioned that she'd noticed him while cleaning up the image and wondered if he might be a family member or friend. Dorothy's response came within hours, and it was longer than Emma expected. She explained that her grandmother, the bride in the photograph, had been named Rosa Castellano before her marriage, which made Emma sit up straighter. Castellano was Emma's own surname, common enough in Boston's Italian community, but still a coincidence that felt significant. Dorothy wrote that she knew very little about her grandmother's early life. Rosa had rarely spoken about her childhood or her wedding day, deflecting questions with vague answers or changing the subject entirely. She had married Gerald Harris, a banker's son from a prominent Providence family, in April 1927. The marriage had produced 2 children, including Dorothy's mother, but by all accounts it had been cold and formal, lacking warmth or genuine affection. Rosa had died in 1982, taking most of her secrets with her. Dorothy's mother remembered her grandmother as distant and sad, a woman who seemed to be perpetually mourning something unnamed. There were whispered family stories about Rosa having come from a poor immigrant family, that the marriage to Gerald had been arranged somehow, but no one had ever confirmed the details. As for the man in the photograph's background, Dorothy had no idea who he might be. She asked Emma to include him in the restoration. Maybe seeing him clearly will help us figure out who he was. Emma finished the restoration over the next week, bringing the image to a level of clarity that would have been impossible even a decade earlier. When she was done, the photograph looked as crisp and detailed as if it had been taken yesterday. Every face was visible, every detail sharp, including the mysterious man in his shadowed corner and the blood on the bride's glove where the rose thorn had pierced the fabric. She sent the completed file to Dorothy with a detailed invoice and a note saying she hoped the family could identify the unknown guest. Then, unable to shake her curiosity, Emma began her own research into Rosa Castellano and her 1927 wedding to Gerald Harris. The Providence Journal's digitized archives included a brief announcement of the wedding in the society pages. It described the ceremony at St. Augustine's Church, the prominent families in attendance, and the bride's simple elegance. But the announcement included one detail that made Emma's breath catch. The bride, formerly of Boston's North End, was given in marriage by her uncle, Mr. Antonio Russo, her parents being deceased. Parents deceased. Emma immediately wondered if that was true, or if it was simply what had been reported to make the match more socially acceptable. Emma had grown up in Boston's North End, the historic Italian neighborhood where narrow streets still bore the names of the immigrants who had transformed them into a piece of Italy transplanted to America. Her own family had roots there going back to the early 1900s, when her great-grandparents had arrived from Sicily seeking better lives. She began searching through immigration records, census data, and church archives, looking for any information about Rosa Castellano and her family. The 1920 census listed a Rosa Castellano, age 12, living on Hanover Street with her parents, Lucia and Marco Castellano, and 2 younger siblings. Marco was listed as a laborer, working at the docks. The family lived in a tenement building that still stood, though it had been renovated into expensive condominiums. The 1930 census told a different story. There was no listing for Marco or Lucia Castellano anywhere in Boston. Rosa's younger siblings, Giuseppe and Maria, appeared in the records of a Catholic orphanage in Worcester, Massachusetts, listed as having been placed there in 1926, the year before Rosa's wedding. The reason given for their placement: father deceased, mother unable to provide care. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Rosa's parents hadn't been deceased when she married Gerald Harris, or at least her mother hadn't been. Something had happened to the family between 1920 and 1927. Something that had scattered the children and erased the parents from the records. She expanded her search, looking through death certificates and church burial records. She found Marco Castellano's death certificate dated November 1925. Cause of death: injuries sustained in industrial accident. He had been 42 years old, leaving behind a wife and 3 children. But there was no death certificate for Lucia Castellano. Emma searched every possible variation of the name, checked hospital records and asylum registrations, even looked through poorhouse admissions. Lucia had simply vanished from the documentary record sometime between her husband's death in late 1925 and her daughter's wedding in April 1927. Emma turned to newspaper archives, searching for any mention of the Castellano family. She found Marco's obituary, a brief notice in the Italian-language newspaper Il Progresso, mentioning his widow and children. She found another mention 6 months later, in March 1926, a small article about a tenement fire on Hanover Street that had displaced several families, including the widow Castellano and her children. After that, nothing. No further mentions of Lucia Castellano, no records of where the family had gone after the fire, no indication of what had happened to separate Rosa from her mother and siblings. Emma sat back from her computer, pieces of a puzzle forming in her mind. A young girl loses her father, then her home. Her younger siblings end up in an orphanage. She herself, at 19, marries into a wealthy family whose social circle would never have intersected with that of a dock worker's daughter under normal circumstances. And a man in working clothes hides in the shadows of her wedding, watching with grief and desperate intensity. St. Augustine's Church in Providence still stood on Westminster Street, its Gothic Revival architecture a landmark in the neighborhood. Emma called the parish office and explained that she was researching a wedding that had taken place there in 1927. The secretary was helpful, but explained that records from that era were stored in the diocesan archives and would require a formal request to access. Emma submitted the request, citing her work as a photo restoration specialist and her interest in providing historical context for her client. While waiting for approval, she decided to search for information about the groom's family. The Harris name appeared frequently in Providence Society columns from the 1920s, charity events, business announcements, engagement notices. Gerald Harris's father, Theodore Harris, had been vice president of Providence Savings Bank. The family lived on Benefit Street, in one of the elegant federal-style homes that had been built when Providence was a major shipping port. Gerald himself had attended Brown University and was being groomed to take over his father's position at the bank. A society column from December 1926 announced Gerald's engagement to Miss Rosa Castellano of Boston, describing her as a young lady of quiet refinement and gentle manner, currently residing with her uncle in Providence. The engagement had been brief, announced in December, married in April just 4 months later. Emma found that suspicious. Society weddings of that era typically involved longer engagements, elaborate preparations, months of planning. A 4-month engagement suggested urgency, perhaps even pressure. The diocesan archives finally granted Emma access to the marriage records. She drove to Providence on a Saturday morning, meeting with an archivist in the basement of the diocesan offices where century-old ledgers were carefully preserved in climate-controlled storage. The marriage register for St. Augustine's Church included the entry for Gerald Harris and Rosa Castellano, dated April 16, 1927. The officiant was Father Michael O'Brien. The witnesses were Theodore Harris and a woman named Catherine Russo, presumably Rosa's aunt, sister to the uncle who had given her away. But there was a note in the margin, written in faded ink. Bans waived by special dispensation. Bishop's approval. Emma asked the archivist what this meant. The woman explained that normally, marriage bans were announced for 3 consecutive Sundays before a wedding, allowing anyone with objections to come forward. A waiver meant the marriage had been rushed, approved directly by the bishop without the normal waiting period. That usually happened for urgent reasons, the archivist said carefully. Sometimes medical, if someone was dying and wanted to see a marriage before passing, sometimes other circumstances. Emma understood the implication. She asked if there were any other records associated with the marriage. Letters, dispensation documents, anything that might explain the rush. The archivist checked her database and found something unexpected. A letter, filed with the marriage records, from Theodore Harris to Bishop Hickey, dated March 1927. The archivist brought Emma the letter, carefully preserved in an acid-free sleeve. It was written on expensive stationery, Theodore Harris's name embossed at the top, the handwriting precise and controlled. "Your Excellency," it began, "I write to request special dispensation for the marriage of my son, Gerald Theodore Harris, to Miss Rosa Castellano. The circumstances require discretion and expediency. Miss Castellano is a virtuous young woman of Italian heritage, currently in the guardianship of her uncle, Mr. Antonio Russo, following the recent death of her father and the unfortunate incapacitation of her mother. My son has formed an attachment to Miss Castellano, and while the match would not ordinarily be suitable given the disparity in social standing, certain circumstances have arisen that make the marriage advisable. Miss Castellano is without family support or financial means. Her uncle, Mr. Russo has indicated that he cannot continue to provide for her indefinitely and has expressed concern about her future prospects. I have made inquiries into Miss Castellano's character and background. Despite her humble origins, she has been educated by the Sisters at St. Mary's and is suitable for elevation into respectable society. The marriage will be conducted quietly, without elaborate celebration, and will provide the young woman with security while satisfying my son's wishes. I trust Your Excellency will understand the need for discretion in this matter and grant the requested dispensation for an expedited marriage without the customary delay of bans. Emma read the letter 3 times, anger building with each reading. The language was careful, diplomatic, but the reality it described was brutal. Rosa hadn't been a beloved bride marrying for love. She'd been a transaction, a solution to a problem, a poor immigrant girl with no family protection being married off to satisfy a wealthy young man's attachment while elevating her out of poverty. The phrase "unfortunate incapacitation of her mother" particularly troubled Emma. What did that mean? Mental illness? Physical disability? Or something worse? Had Lucia Castellano been institutionalized, perhaps placed in an asylum when she couldn't care for her children after the fire and her husband's death? Emma photographed the letter with her phone and continued searching the archives. She found one more document, the certificate of guardianship showing that Antonio Russo, described as Rosa's maternal uncle, had become her legal guardian in August 1926 after the fire. There was no mention of what had happened to Lucia Castellano, only that she was unable to provide parental care. The archivist helped Emma search for any records of Lucia's whereabouts. They found an admission record from the Rhode Island State Hospital for Mental Diseases, dated July 1926. Lucia Castellano had been committed there, suffering from what the doctors termed melancholia and nervous exhaustion following traumatic loss. She had been 29 years old, widowed, homeless after the fire, unable to care for her 3 children. The hospital records showed that Lucia had remained institutionalized there for years. She had never been released, dying in the hospital in 1944, 17 years after her daughter's wedding, having spent nearly half her life locked away. Emma's hands trembled as she read the final record. Rosa had been 19 when she married Gerald Harris, her mother alive but committed to an asylum, her siblings in an orphanage, herself essentially alone in the world except for an uncle who saw her as a burden. The marriage must have seemed like her only option for survival, even if it meant marrying a man she barely knew, entering a world completely foreign to her. But who was the man in the shadows of the wedding photo? And why had he been watching with such grief? Emma couldn't let the mystery rest. She contacted Dorothy again, sharing what she'd discovered about Rosa's background: the father's death, the fire, the mother's institutionalization, the rushed marriage that had been more rescue than romance. Dorothy was shocked, but also relieved to finally have some answers about her grandmother's sadness. "She used to cry on her birthday," Dorothy wrote back. "Every year, without fail. My mother asked her once why, and she said she was crying for all the birthdays she should have celebrated but couldn't. We never understood what she meant." Emma asked if Dorothy would be willing to share the restored photograph more widely, perhaps posting it on genealogy forums or social media groups focused on Italian-American history. Someone might recognize the man in the shadows, might have information about who he was and why he'd been there. Dorothy agreed, and Emma created a high-resolution crop of that corner of the photograph, showing the man's face as clearly as her restoration had revealed it. She posted it on several genealogy websites and Facebook groups dedicated to Boston's North End history, along with a brief explanation. This man was present at a wedding in Providence in April 1927. The bride was Rosa Castellano, originally from Boston's North End. Trying to identify him, any information would be appreciated. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of people commented, sharing similar stories of immigrant families torn apart by poverty, death, and institutionalization. Several people suggested the man might have been a family friend, a former neighbor, someone from Rosa's old life who had come to see her one last time. Then, 3 days after Emma posted the image, she received a private message from a woman named Angela Rossini in Medford, Massachusetts. The message was brief but electric. "I think that man in the photograph is my grandfather, Paolo Benedetti. He died in 1952, but I have a photograph of him from around that time period, and the resemblance is striking. Is there any way we could talk?" Emma immediately called the number Angela provided. The woman who answered was elderly, her voice warm but trembling slightly with age and emotion. She explained that her grandfather Paolo had worked at the docks in Boston, had been friends with many of the Italian families in the North End. He had never married, living alone in a small apartment until his death at 73. My father always said his father had loved someone once, a young woman who he couldn't marry because of circumstances beyond their control, Angela said. He never spoke about it himself, but my father found letters after he died. Love letters, written in Italian, that were never sent. They were addressed to someone named Rosa, but there was no last name, nothing to identify who she was. Emma's pulse raced. Do you still have those letters? I do, Angela said. I kept them because the handwriting was so beautiful, and the love in them was so profound, even though I didn't know the whole story. Would you like to see them? 2 days later, Emma sat in Angela's living room in Medford, holding a bundle of letters tied with string, the paper yellowed but the ink still clear. There were 12 letters in all, written in elegant Italian script, dated between August 1926 and March 1927. Emma's Italian was rusty, but she could make out enough to understand the story they told. Paolo Benedetti had been 38 years old in 1926, working at the Boston docks, unmarried, but hoping to save enough money to bring his mother over from Italy. He had met Rosa Castellano in 1925, when she was just 17, the daughter of his friend and fellow dock worker Marco Castellano. The first letter, dated August 1926, spoke of Marco's death and Paolo's promise to help watch over Rosa and her siblings. Your father was my brother in all but blood, he wrote. I will honor his memory by protecting his family as he would have protected mine. But the subsequent letters revealed that protection had transformed into something deeper. By October 1926, Paolo's feelings for Rosa had evolved into love. Complicated, impossible love, given their age difference and Rosa's desperate circumstances. She was 18 by then, homeless after the fire, her mother institutionalized, her siblings taken away to an orphanage. I am too old for you, he wrote in November. I have nothing to offer but a dock worker's wages and a one-room apartment. Your uncle tells me you deserve better, that you need security I cannot provide. He is right, and yet my heart breaks knowing this truth. The letter from January 1927 was longer, more anguished. Paolo had learned that Rosa's uncle had arranged for her to meet Gerald Harris, that a marriage was being discussed. They will take you to a world I cannot enter, he wrote. You will live in fine houses, wear beautiful clothes, never worry about hunger or cold. This is what you deserve, what you need, and I am selfish to wish otherwise. But Rosa, know that I would have married you tomorrow if circumstances allowed. I would have worked 3 jobs to give you security. I would have brought your siblings to live with us, found a way to visit your mother, kept your family together. But I am one man with nothing, and they are offering you everything. The final letter, dated March 1927, was the shortest and most devastating. I have learned the date of your wedding. I know I should not come, that my presence will only cause pain. But I cannot let you go without seeing you one last time, without witnessing the moment when you become forever beyond my reach. Forgive me for this weakness. I will stay hidden. I will not interfere. I will not burden you with my grief. But I must see you just once more, to carry that image with me through all the empty years ahead. Emma set down the letters, tears blurring her vision. Paolo Benedetti had been the man in the shadows, hiding in the corner of St. Augustine's church, watching the woman he loved marry someone else because he couldn't give her the security she desperately needed. Angela was crying too. I never knew, she said softly. He raised my father alone after my grandmother died in childbirth when my father was just a baby. He worked his whole life at the docks, never complained, never spoke of being lonely. But now I understand. He was always lonely, from the moment he watched Rosa walk down that aisle. Emma asked if she could make copies of the letters, if Angela would be willing to share this story with Dorothy. Angela agreed immediately. Rosa should be remembered for who she really was, she said. Not just as Gerald Harris's wife, but as a woman who survived impossible circumstances, who was loved deeply even though she couldn't choose that love. Emma spent the next week compiling everything she'd discovered into a comprehensive document. The wedding photograph with detailed enhancement of Paolo in the shadows, copies of the letters, the church records, the asylum documents, the census data showing the Castellano family's trajectory from struggling immigrants to scattered survivors. She sent it all to Dorothy, along with a letter explaining what she believed had happened. Rosa Castellano, orphaned at 18, homeless and destitute, had been loved by Paolo Benedetti but couldn't afford to choose love over survival. Her uncle had arranged the marriage to Gerald Harris, a transaction disguised as romance. Rosa had married Gerald knowing she was condemning herself to a loveless life, but securing safety and respectability in exchange. Paolo had come to the wedding despite knowing it would break his heart, hiding in the shadows to see her one last time. That single red rose among the lily of the valley. Emma now believed Rosa had put it there herself, a silent acknowledgement of the love she was sacrificing, perhaps even a message to Paolo if he came. Dorothy's response was immediate and emotional. She shared the document with her mother, Rosa's daughter, now 86 years old. The elderly woman read everything, studied the enhanced photograph, traced her finger over Paolo's face in the shadows. "My mother used to have nightmares," Dorothy's mother wrote to Emma. "She would wake up crying, calling out for someone named Paolo. My father would get angry, demand to know who Paolo was. She would say she didn't remember, that it was just a dream. But now I understand. She was dreaming of the man she loved, the man she couldn't have. She carried him in her heart for her entire life, even though she could never speak his name." The family decided to share the story publicly, posting it on genealogy forums and Italian-American Historical Society websites. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people came forward with similar stories: immigrant families torn apart by poverty, women forced into marriages of convenience, men who had loved and lost because they couldn't compete with wealth and security. Several historians contacted Emma, interested in using the case as part of research into immigrant experiences in 1920s New England. The photograph and the letters became part of an exhibit at the Immigration Museum in Boston, documenting the hidden emotional costs of poverty and social inequality. But the most profound response came from an unexpected source: the Harris family descendants. Gerald Harris's grandson contacted Dorothy, apologizing for what his grandfather had done, acknowledging that the marriage had been a form of exploitation, even if it had been legal and socially acceptable at the time. "My grandfather wasn't a villain," he wrote, "but he participated in a system that treated women as commodities, that valued social standing over human connection. Rosa deserved better. She deserved to choose." 6 months after Emma first noticed the man in the shadows, she stood in Mount Hope Cemetery in Boston's Mattapan neighborhood. Dorothy and her mother had traveled from Providence. Angela Rossini was there with her adult children. Several members of the Italian-American Historical Society had come to witness the moment. They stood before 2 graves. The first was Rosa's. She had been buried there in 1982, her headstone reading simply, "Rosa Harris, beloved mother and grandmother, 1907-1982. The second grave, 50 feet away, was Paolo Benedetti's, marked with an even simpler stone. Paolo Benedetti, 1888-1952. For 70 years, they had rested in the same cemetery, neither knowing the other was so close. Dorothy's mother placed a bouquet on Rosa's grave, lily of the valley, traditional wedding flowers with a single red rose tucked among them, just as there had been in Rosa's bridal bouquet 97 years earlier. Angela placed an identical bouquet on Paolo's grave. "They couldn't be together in life," Dorothy's mother said, her voice strong despite her age. "But we can honor both of them now, acknowledge the love that existed, even though circumstances wouldn't allow it." Emma had brought a framed copy of the enhanced wedding photograph. Instead of the full image, she had created a new composition: 2 separate prints, mounted side by side. The left frame showed Rosa at the altar, her face clear and beautiful, the red rose visible in her bouquet. The right frame showed Paolo in the shadows, his expression of love and loss preserved forever. The frames were mounted on a memorial bench the families had commissioned, placed between the 2 graves. A plaque explained the story in brief: Rosa Castellano and Paolo Benedetti, separated by circumstance, united in memory. May their story remind us that love exists even when it cannot be chosen, and that every life contains depths invisible to the casual observer. As the small group gathered around the bench, Angela shared one final detail she had discovered. Among her grandfather's belongings, she had found a small notebook where he had recorded important dates. April 16th, Rosa's wedding day, was marked every year from 1927 until his death in 1952, with a single word written in Italian: Ricordo. Remember. For 25 years, Paolo had privately commemorated the day he lost Rosa, keeping his love alive in solitude, honoring what they might have had if the world had been different. Dorothy's mother opened a folder and withdrew a letter, carefully unfolding it. "This was found among my mother's papers after she died," she explained. "We didn't understand it then, but now it makes sense." The letter, written in Rosa's handwriting, was dated 1980, 2 years before her death. It had never been sent, had no address, was simply titled, "To Paolo, wherever you are." She read aloud, "I have lived a comfortable life. I raised children. I never wanted for material things. But not a day passed that I didn't think of you, standing in the shadows of the church, bearing witness to a choice I had no choice but to make. I hope you found happiness. I hope you found love. I hope you forgave me for not being brave enough to choose poverty with you over security without you. In another life, in another world, I would have said yes to you 1,000 times over." The letter had been written 53 years after the wedding, long after Gerald Harris had died, long after Paolo himself had passed away. Rosa had carried her love for him to the end, even though they had only had a brief time together before circumstances tore them apart. As Emma photographed the memorial bench and the two graves with their matching bouquets, she thought about the photograph that had started this journey. A seemingly ordinary wedding picture that had contained within it a story of profound love and loss. The man in the shadows was no longer mysterious or creepy, but deeply human, a man who had loved so completely that he had traveled to witness his own heartbreak. The photograph would remain in the Immigration Museum, but copies now hung in both families' homes. The man in the shadows had a name now: Paolo Benedetti, dock worker, devoted friend, faithful lover. And Rosa was no longer just Mrs. Gerald Harris of Providence, but Rosa Castellano, a woman who had survived impossible circumstances and carried a secret love for her entire life. Their story had been hidden for nearly a century in the shadows of a wedding photograph. Now, finally, it was told. A testament to the complexity of human lives, the impossibility of knowing someone's story from a single image, and the enduring power of love that persists even when it cannot be fulfilled. The creepy detail in the photograph had been transformed into something beautiful. Proof that even in moments of loss and sacrifice, love exists, witnesses remain, and eventually, if we look closely enough, the truth emerges from the shadows into the light.